probably useful just to take a couple of moments and do a quick refresher on how Senate process and procedure works. So in the United States Senate, when a bill is introduced and when it comes to the floor, we have to do what's called a motion to proceed. And the motion to proceed, and the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed, is a 60-vote threshold in the United States Senate. The 60-vote threshold, of course, is the filibuster. Now, folks in this body might remember how deeply I care about the filibuster, because it requires comity, it requires compromise, and it requires individuals of different parties to work together to solve problems. And often, it has been an object of contention in this body. But I support the filibuster because I believe it requires us to work together to solve problems, hear everyone's ideas, and incorporate them as we move forward on legislation. But of course, before you can actually amend a piece of legislation on the Senate floor, you first must pass the motion to invoke cloture. We held that vote yesterday at 1:59 p.m. I've got the copy of the roll call vote right here in front of me. And unfortunately, there were only 49 senators who voted yes to move forward on yesterday's package. There were 50 senators who voted no to move forward on the package. And of course, what the motion to invoke cloture was on the shell of the bill. The substitute that would be filed is this bill right here. This bill is 370 pages long. Most of this legislation is the border bill, which we spent over 4 months negotiating in a bipartisan way. I was very grateful that Senator Graham's team and Senator Graham himself were integral parts of that conversation. So, this bill is subject to debate and subject to amendment, but only after a motion to invoke cloture is passed, which requires 60 votes. Now, my good friend from South Carolina indicated that he would like to offer some amendments. Some of the ideas that he was discussing are ideas that I very much support. I would look forward to debating and possibly even supporting one or more of his amendments. But alas, we are unable to consider those amendments because yesterday the Senate chose to vote no on the motion to invoke cloture to move forward on this legislation. Therefore, we are not able to amend or debate this bill. The Senate later moved forward with a piece of legislation very similar to this, but missing the entire border section. So we are now in a period of waiting until our next vote to invoke another cloture, in which potentially, if unanimous consent occurs in this body, we could consider additional amendments. However, it could be more difficult to consider some of those border-related amendments, since the package now does not include any of the border language that we carefully negotiated over the last 4.5 months. So, Mr. President, members of the Senate, folks who are listening, just to be clear, it seemed clear to me, and I think to everyone in the United States Senate, that had we passed this motion to invoke cloture yesterday with 60+ votes, we would be currently debating, offering, and voting on amendments to the border provisions of the bill that was drafted. And each of those amendments would have been germane, which means they would have been voted at a 51-vote threshold, a simple majority to move forward. Alas, because this body chose not to invoke cloture, we have moved on to a different piece of legislation, one that does not include the border components. So while there may be amendments offered at some point over the next several days, it will be a very different debate than the amendments that would be offered before. And I know that my friend from South Carolina is currently drafting an amendment, which I appreciate. The amendment that he is drafting for current discussion would have to incorporate the entirety of the border bill package with some minor changes to the language that we drafted and voted on yesterday in order to consider his amendment. So I would suggest that perhaps if we had wanted to have a robust debate and open this to an open amendment process, the time to do that would have been yesterday at 1:59 p.m. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield.